If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. What's the creepiest thing you've seen in a forest, camping, hiking trails, etc., that you can't explain? I was solo hiking in the Colorado high country once. It wasn't a 14er, but it wasn't a walk up a molehill either. It was quite the perfect day hiking up, midsummer, sunshine, no clouds in the sky, and plenty of birds in the trees. After making it to the summit and walking back down, however, I was following the trail when the entire ambience of the forest just stopped. Everything grew dead silent. No birds in the trees, no passing wind, just a dead, stark silence. I took notice of it right away but continued. But as I walked on, I kept getting the feeling that something was watching me. Nothing happened, and I thankfully didn't run into anything, but that feeling of being watched followed me all the way back down the mountain. That sound of pure silence still gives me the creeps. I've been hiking all my life, and I've never heard a forest turn quiet so quickly. I lived in a national park by myself for 3 months. Several times when I was going back to my trailer for the day, I would hear music like a music box or an ice cream truck. It was always loud and sounded like it was coming from somewhere over my head. One day, I decided to look for the source, so I followed the dirt road past my trailer. The music continued, and I couldn't tell if I was getting closer or not. I had my eyes on the trees and looked down just in time to avoid stepping on a snake. I scrambled back, but it didn't move. I realized it was dead, and it wasn't alone. There were half a dozen dead copperheads stretched out in the road, looking in the same direction. I went back to get my car because I couldn't bring myself to step over them, but by the time I got my keys, the music had stopped, and I didn't hear it again. The strangest thing I have ever seen was somewhere in West Virginia years ago. Was hiking through the woods off trail, came across a big-ass random field that was clearly someone's farm. I was about to go around until I noticed a bunch of people wearing what looked like cloth diapers and head wraps while burning a cross with a pig hanging from a chain. They were speaking in a language that I did not recognize. They saw me, we both had the deer in a headlight look for what felt like forever. A few started my way. I have never ran back up a mountain in the dark, so fast for so long. I have no ducking clue what they were doing. I don't think I could find that place again if I wanted to. But WV has some weird people in it. Strangest thing I saw in general was a dead dude wrapped in a tarp that fell off of someone's pickup truck. They came back and got it. Also found dead bodies buried in unmarked graves in the woods of some property I used to have. There was this walking trail that followed the river. The trail was supposed to be very old, and used by Native Americans. I had walked it, but it was hard to access unless started at one end. I knew a place where it was close to a road by a farmer's field. I wanted to use my metal detector to look for old coins. The farmer was there, and I had to ask permission, of course. I walked a few miles one way, then other. I found a funny brown bottle with 1929 dimes in it. There was a batch of trees next to river connected to the farmer's field. It was sort of in big C curve in the river. It was river on all sides, and cornfield on one side. There was animal skulls in the woods. I don't know what they were. Deer, then smaller things like a raccoons, maybe a skunk? The farmer was working in the field. He was kind of threatening looking. He was tall, and bald. He asked what I found. I showed him the bottle. He said it was his grandfather's. He popped a similar bottle out of his pocket. Brown glass that said Bel Air. I gave it to him the on I found. He said, thanks. I told him about the animal skulls. He said, yeah? Show me. We walked to the spot with the skulls. He was quiet, but he wanted to see them. He poked the skull with his boot, but didn't touch it. We saw another skull. He said, I think it's dog. We left. He said he didn't like the woods. He was 76, and he found skulls there since he was a boy. I said some explanation. He said, animals' heads don't fall off, while the body takes a walk. When I was younger, about 35 years ago, I used to hike a lot in the local forest preserves. I would usually bicycle in and then walk a few miles further on the smaller trails. One day I came across an abandoned house, but it was in such bad shape that I wouldn't dare go in. I walked around it and found the old cellar stairs. It was early afternoon, but only the first few stairs were visible. The rest was pitch black and there was a chilly draft coming out of the hole. I pondered going down just a couple of steps but decided against it, so I threw a couple of rocks down there and never heard them hit anything. I noped out of there but wanted to come back with a flashlight, but even after searching, I never found that spot again. Saran wrap looking thing that climbed from tree to tree. This happened in the Philippines. I wouldn't say it's on a trail, but my grandparents had a mango tree grove that covered almost 130 acres. One afternoon, me and two of my cousins were having snacks on the balcony when we saw this thing appear, climbing down from a mango tree, then climbing up on the next tree or reaching on another tree branch to traverse it. It was hard for us to describe it at that time, but to the best of my memory, it was a flat, freeform, see-through looking thing that could stretch and used its four corners to grab onto branches, hence why I called it saran wrap. One of the weird parts is that this thing looked as light as a feather, but when it grabbed the branches or if it was on a branch, the branch crackled as if it had tremendous weight. Another weird thing is that the grove is usually noisy with birds chirping, but when this thing appeared, it was dead silent. That evening, we told our uncle and grandpa about what we saw. My uncle grabbed a dried stingray tail from a cabinet and hung it on the wall of the balcony. My grandpa told us not to hang out there anymore after 6 p.m. We asked our uncle what the dried stingray tail was for, and he said it was to drive bad spirits away. My friends and I used to camp a lot in the El Dorado National Forest. We had a spot along Sapiago Springs that we used to camp at a lot. One weekend, we decided to go on a 3-day foraging camp. We brought in MREs in case we couldn't find anything, some guns, and some supplies to set up shelter, but that's about it. The first night was chill. We cooked a bunch of crawdads and a squirrel my buddy shot, drank a few beers we'd brought, and slept fine. The next day, something felt off to me. One of my friends who was with me and I had had some really creepy experiences in this part of the forest in the past, and it felt a bit like those. The forest was dead silent, and you felt like something was watching you. I grew up in the woods, so I know the signs of a predator, but this felt different than a bear or a mountain lion. When night fell, my friends went 200 yards or so up the stream to do some stuff, and I was alone in camp. The feeling got even stronger, so I built up the fire nice and big and grabbed a gun. I kept hearing faint voices from the woods in the opposite direction of where my friends went. They were low, indistinct sounds, but they were creeping me out significantly, and my buddies had taken the only 2 flashlights, poor planning in hindsight. As I peered out into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of something moving 50 yards or so out in the trees. I snapped the rifle to my shoulder and got the scope on it. It was pretty dark, and the only light was from the fire, but I could see the outline of what I was aiming at. It looked human but was on all fours, and its arms seemed a lot longer than they should. It stood a bit like an ape, but very low to the ground. I only saw it for a second before it loped off deeper into the woods. After I lost track of it, I'd hear light rustling in different directions around the camp, leaves scuffling, the occasional twig breaking. Always away from where my friends went, in the 180% on the other side of the camp from their departure. I got the sense that whatever it was stalking me. I kept the fire high and was staying sharp, looking out into the woods, but I didn't see it again. My buddies came back about 10 minutes later to find me a paranoid wreck, glassing the tree line with the scope. I told them what happened, and they got quiet. They then told me the reason they came back when they did was because they started hearing the same SHT I did over by where they were, and it spooked them. We spent the second night of our trip with a big-ass fire and 3 lookouts. Nobody slept that night. In the morning, we broke camp as quick as we could and hightailed it out of there. We never camped in that spot again. I was exploring a new trail I'd never been to before near the Lake Bonneville Shoreline Trail, and I was having a lovely time until I came to a long straight section of the trail, and I could see up ahead 2 trees that looked like they've been propped together to create an incomplete archway over the trail, and on the tip of each tree was a deer skull, placed so that if you walked in the center of the trail, they were both looking down at you as you passed them. Seeing this obviously sets off some alarm bells. I kept walking, but you can bet I kept a firm grip on the handle of my big old knife I keep with me while hiking. Moments after I passed the archway with the skulls, I started getting chills all over, and I felt like I was being watched. I also remember it suddenly getting very quiet in the woods, where moments before I could hear birds and the chatter of small animals in the brush. Anyone who is an experienced outdoorsman can tell you that sudden silence in the woods is not a good sign. It generally means there's a predator of some kind nearby. It almost feels like the whole forest is holding its breath to wait for it to pass. I only made it like 20 feet past the archway before the bad feeling in my gut convinced me to turn around and leave. I felt like I was being stalked or watched the whole time I was going down the trail, until I got closer to the parking lot. I didn't see a thing, though. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about, but I'm glad I listened to my gut and turned around. Any supernatural explanations aside, it easily could have been a cougar or a black or grizzly bear that was living out there. Or a moose. I didn't see or experience anything other than the feeling of being followed or watched. When you're out in the mountains alone, though, you trust that gut feeling. Go for a walk on the outskirts of a very small town, 25,000 people, in the middle of nowhere in Russia. There is a nice forest park with some cool and weird sculptures made by a local. Venture out further beyond the trails into the deeper and more overgrown part. There was a small coombe and a tree stub standing before it. On the stub, what I saw was a neatly placed horse skull, with various bones, ribs, I guess, scattered around by the stub. Obscure and secluded place, completely out of the blue. The bones were in ducking good condition too, there was no yellowing. But perhaps the strangest was when me and my friend literally saw with our own eyes. Is kind of like a forest guardian spirit in Russian folklore. But I don't feel like elaborating on it because people probably won't believe me and both of us weren't exactly sober. I will just say that it looked like a 4-meter tall black shadow with a kind of hooded figure and glowing eyes. I camp solo a lot in national parks and forests. Not only is it free, but I can let my dogs run wild. Throughout my many travels, the creepiest SHT always happens in these places. 2 things happened in one night at the camp, both involving the same friend and both involving my need to go to the bathroom. At around 10 p.m., I needed to spit. So I left our site to use the restrooms, which were about 1/4 mile away. It's pitch dark. As I was walking, I saw one of my friends who was with us walk from a path leading to an unused site onto the main path. This unused site path was a good 50 yards away from our site path. My friend has a very noticeable and peculiar gait, way of walking. So I knew it was him. At multiple points, he turned around and asked, "Why are you following me?" Always a good 40 or so feet ahead of me. I would reply, "I literally told you guys I was going to the bathroom," and ask, "Why did you come from a different site?" He picked his pace up, and I eventually lost him in the darkness. I get to the restrooms without seeing him, take my shit, and upon returning to my site, where he of course is, I start asking why I'm being ducked with. Everyone denies that my friend even left. Okay, so they're ducking around, no big deal. 3 a.m. rolls around, and I wake up needing to pee. No need to walk to the restrooms this time. I'll just walk off into the woods for a bit. As I walk back after my piss, I hear the distinct sound of a tent zipper opening. In the darkness, I can tell it's my friend, and then I can barely see but definitely hear him zip it back up. As I get closer to the tents, I see him more clearly, and he walks a bit. He goes to light a cigarette. I can see his face and the flint strikes of the lighter, even clearer when it manages to catch. He lights his cigarette, takes a puff, and says, "Can you hear me?" Me, "Yeah, I can hear you, what's up?" Again, much louder this time, not enough to hallucinate. He denies he ever left his tent or went through the woods ahead of me. I camp and hike a lot here, in Alaska. This state is so vast and large that it's difficult to put it into context. Once, I flew into a remote lake to do some sheep hunting about 20 years ago. Rocky cliffs, bluffs, and mountains were just a mile away. I'm new to this area, and after consulting with a pilot friend of mine, he decides to drop me off at this tiny lake he's never been to before. We gear up, fly there, and land on the water. Totally uneventful. He'll be picking me back up in 5 days, weather permitting. I set up camp among tundra and low bushes, and it runs as far as I can see towards the mountain. First night, I've got a small fire and a tent for shelter. I wake up early and start scouting the hillside with my spotting scope. Off in the distance, on the crest of this first large rocky hill, before you actually get onto the foot of the mountain, I see a silhouette of what appears to be a large man standing with a ghillie suit on. But then it just turned and disappeared with its back to me and seemed to walk away, almost ape-like. I keep looking, hoping for another glance, and a short time later it reappears above the crest, sort of sneakily making its way higher. I'm watching as this all unfolds, but with every step, I begin to realize this isn't a bear, and it's not a human. I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't a ghillie suit, it was hair I was seeing. As I watched longer, this ducking thing stopped and looked around, still ducking standing. I'm certain it saw my yellow tent and small smoke trails above the ground. Paranoia set in because I didn't know what the duck I was looking at and honestly felt it was looking at me. For what seemed like an eternity, it stood there, looking in my direction. But then it squatted, did a 180 degrees turn, and just disappeared. I continued looking through the day but saw nothing. And no, I didn't go up that mountain. Later that night, I'll have my .44 next to me and my .270 WSM ready to go. My small fire is dwindling, and I can hear silence and the crackling of wood and embers. Out of ducking nowhere, I hear the loudest screeching or screaming visceral anger outcry I've ever heard. It was coming from the direction of the mountain. It was then that I realized, holy SHT, did I just run into Bigfoot? I didn't sleep a wink that night. Kept the fire stoked and burned through 150 pounds of wood in the remaining 4 days at night. I didn't get a sheep and didn't see any other signs of Bigfoot those 4 days. I was in the middle of nowhere in the woods in NorCal one night and saw a row of lights in the sky. The people I was with called me out and said, "Hey, you're the logical one, give us some reasons for this." So I did. I said, "What about a plane?" But no, the light patterns were way off. What about a military plane or stealth bomber? Nope. Wrong shape. What about a drone? Nope, too high up, and it was silent. A satellite? Nope, not the right shape and not quite far enough away. The lights were very, very high up, and when I borrowed binoculars, I saw that the lights were in a succession of rainbow colors, like an LED light that fades in and out. It suddenly shot left, then right, then directly upward, and disappeared. I had no explanation, and neither did my group. We were stunned. I went out crystal hunting with 2 friends in the PNW several years ago and ended up lost for a while. The path down the mountain we were on was pretty straightforward, but somehow I got drawn out into a thicket of rings of trees near a very camouflaged cliffside. What was weird, though, was that everything felt very heavy, and I heard giggling all around me right around the time I lost the path. Thankfully, my phone worked, and I was able to direct my voice to my friends after calling to tell them what happened. I walked up to them after hearing their voices, and when we went to get back on the trail, they couldn't find it. Here's the thing, though, they're both experienced hikers, campers, and outdoor people. I hadn't strayed off more than 20 feet, and they were right near other crystal hunters on the base of a mountain. I heard those people too, but when we came back up, there was nothing. My friends navigated us down the mountain regardless, and we ended up all the way back to the main road. One of the friends said she heard the giggling too and just didn't want to say anything until we got out of the area. It was spooky. We almost felt like we'd been chased off the mountain. One time at band camp, sorry, I had to. But on a serious note, in Wisconsin, there is a lot of Native American land. One campsite in particular is called IMR, Indian Mound Reservation. While in Boy Scouts, I had a very unpleasant experience. I was sleeping in my tent, and I woke to footsteps walking around my tent. It was autumn, so you clearly heard a 2-step walk. But it sounded as if their feet were dragging through the leaves. Slightly damp, so it didn't sound like the dry crinkle kind. It would walk around my tent and then stop by my front door, turn around after a brief pause, and then walk back around the other way. Now it wasn't like some Blair Witch crap that started banging the side of my tent, but it was enough to make me stop and follow the sound with just my head moving in the tent. If anyone has ever experienced the paranormal before, they know exactly what I mean by feeling a spirit presence over a human presence, such as someone lost in our campsite. The camp has burial mounds all over that look like small berms you'd find at a gun range. The next night was nothing, but I slept very light. Solo backpacked into the middle of nowhere, Mogul Lone Rim, Arizona. This was in high elevation, very wet Arizona, not the desert most people are familiar with. Around 7,500 feet, and the area looks more like the wet areas of the Pacific Northwest than anything else. Super remote. Remote enough that I didn't see another soul, and I saw evidence of old pot grows, all several years old and nothing recent, thankfully. Pot growers can be dangerous if you stumble into one of their illegal little farms. The first night, I camped on an, almost, flat bench of ground above a creek. A bench in this context is a large ledge of ground. The bench was about the size of a large living room. I had a brush-covered cliff behind me, impossible to move around on without making noise, and a sheer undercut, by past floods, drop off to the creek in front of me. Other than the faint sound of trickling water, it was a dead quiet night. On this kind of night, you can literally hear a mouse scurrying around in the undergrowth. It was utterly, absolutely quiet, and it was overcast on a new moon, so it was absolutely dark. The area was heavily overgrown with thorny bushes, wild strawberries, and ferns. There was a thick canopy of trees overhead, so thick that I had a hard time getting a signal out with my satellite communicator to report into family. I messaged them every evening when hiking alone. The only way up to the bench was a narrow, steep game trail through thick brush. You couldn't get up to that bench without making a ton of noise by knocking rocks loose and breaking branches. Did I mention it was quiet? It was spooky quiet. No birds during the day, no frogs peeping, no crickets or cicadas, nothing. Dead quiet except for that faint sound of trickling water. It was the kind of quiet where the loudest noise is the sound of your own heartbeat in your ears. In the middle of the night, a bright white light illuminated my tent for a couple minutes. I figured I had a human midnight visitor, possibly up to no good, and I scrambled out of my tent in a hurry. The light disappeared as I unzipped the tent. It's still absolutely dead quiet. I shine my, very good, flashlight around and find nothing. No humans. I listen with the light off and hear nothing. And then off, through the trees, I see a faint flickering white light. It isn't a flashlight. It's more like a glow. Had it not been so dark, I might not have seen anything at all. On a moonlit night, I might have thought it was a particularly bright patch of moonlight. It disappeared after a minute. There was no sound, and I would have heard footsteps if it was anything alive. I was just glad it wasn't an axe murderer, an illegal pot grower, or space aliens. LOL. I sat up until dawn, and there were no other noises. It remained eerily silent. Not even a cricket. In the morning, there were no footprints or signs that anyone had been there. The dawn birds never sang as the sun started to come up. There were never any insect noises. I vowed never to camp on that creepy bench again. I was a stupid kid, 13 to 16, fascinated with hunting but did not grow up in a family that ever hunted. I got my first BB gun, and I went into the woods to see what I could possibly get. I remember coming to a part of the woods where it was a swamp and there used to be an old farmhouse, which when I was younger, like 2 to 3 years ago, used to be still standing but at the time was nothing more than just the foundation or chimney. It was dusk out, everything was gray and shadowy, and I heard huge wings and saw a large bird land on the top of a dead tree. I saw its body shape and thought it were some owl or something, which now, looking back, I love and how majestic they are. It was stupid and probably illegal to hunt. I had a fascination with nature and a lack of knowledge of hunting, but I was a stupid kid and shot anyways. I saw the large bird drop, not quite sure what it actually was. It made a horrible screech on its way down to the ground, and I instantly regretted what I did. No less than a second later, the whole wood started screeching and howling with the most terrible sound I have ever heard. I heard in the trees around me, in almost all the trees, this weird screeching but more like whooping, like 100 witches started howling and whooping started coming from every direction around me. I ran home, which was about a 1/4 mile from where I was, as quick as I could run. I only remembered this now and have looked up every owl distress call I could find for my area, but I couldn't find anything similar to what I heard that night. Needless to say, I'm an avid outdoorsman, and I have the utmost respect for nature and the creatures that live in it. I would never want to hunt anything unless it were to feed me and my family. But that night, which I oddly forgot about until now, was one of the most eerie things I've experienced in the woods. I had a paranormal encounter when I was camping with a few friends in Okanagan Falls, British Columbia, Canada. We were camping to celebrate my 13th birthday, and the girls and I had walked down to the lake for a swim. On the walk back to our campground, we walked along a river that had a fair-sized dam. Unfortunately, there has been an incident where 2 brothers drowned after being unable to escape the turbines a few years earlier. This town was only 40 minutes from my hometown, so we had heard the story on the news. The dam had been marked with a skull and crossbones and large signs saying danger. We were a couple hundred meters down the river and close to our campground when I saw an incredibly clear and bright white figure of a portly preteen boy walking atop the water. I stopped and told my friends to look, and one of them did and exclaimed she saw him too. The other covered her face and said she was too scared to look. We watched him for a few minutes until he faded away. He walked slowly along the river's surface for about 10 meters, then disappeared. It is still the most incredible supernatural encounter I have ever had. This is my dad's story, but when he was a kid in the 60s he was in the Boy Scouts and would go camping with his troop in the Appalachian Mountains. One night, after having fallen asleep in his tent, he woke up standing alone a few feet away from a sheer drop. It was still dark and he had no flashlight or gear, not even shoes. He had to find his way back to the campsite by the moonlight. When he got back no one had realized he was gone. He says that if he hadn't woken up when he did, he would have sleptwalked off the cliff and that no one would have known what happened to him. I'm not really into hiking, but I used to walk some trails in a small park in my city. I was a 15 or 16-year-old girl who loved the peace and quiet of the woods as opposed to the heckling of the street. One day I go in at my usual time after school, around 3 p.m. or so. I wander my usual route, and I should add that it's not possible to get lost because these woods aren't very large. I notice it's getting dark weirdly quick, almost out of nowhere. I suddenly get a call from my mom, who is flipping out and demanding to know where I am. She says she's been calling me for an hour. I tell her I never got any calls, and I've been walking like I always do. She says I've been gone for 3 hours. But I'm never gone for more than an hour. I check my phone, and sure enough, it says 6. Somehow I lost 2 hours of my life in those woods, and I have no idea how or why. It felt like an hour to me. My mom's calls also never showed up on my log, even though I shouldn't lose service there. It's not actually supernatural or unexplainable, but for a lot of people, myself included, sleeping in the wilderness alters their routines enough to bring about some really wacky lucid dreams, nightmares, and sleep paralysis. Some combination of an altered sleep schedule, sleeping in an unfamiliar position on a firmer surface, general heightened anxiety, and survival instinct makes your brain act a bit funny. I go on solo wilderness backpacking trips a couple times a year, and the first couple nights always include insane dreams and sleep paralysis delirium. I have a recurring nightmare of a park ranger entering my tent to check my fishing license. Then he smiles a grotesque, gory, toothless grin and begins extracting my teeth with a buck knife while I am unable to move. I only get spooky dreams in the wilderness. I used to run in the Sam Houston National Forest quite often. There was this one trail that I really enjoyed and always used to run. I ran it so often that I could close my eyes and tell you the twists and turns as well as the mile markers for about 10 miles. Well, being young and dumb, I decided to take the love of my life, now wife, out on a hike around 5 p.m. We brought a string bag with some water and snacks. We both had our phones, but due to it being later in the day, the batteries were drained. It was early October, so the sun set earlier than I was used to. For those who do not know, it gets darker much sooner than you would usually expect in the woods. Anyway, we are about 3 miles out, and the sunlight in the woods is fading ever so quickly, so we decide to head back. As we make our way back, about a mile away, the light is completely gone. We are now hiking back in pitch black, like void pitch black, and decide to whip out our phones. They are dead. So, using my knowledge of the trail and trying to picture an imaginary outline of the trail to follow, we slowly tried to make our way back, and boy was it slow. As we approach an area of the trail where it opens up a bit with fewer trees, we hear a bunch of movement within the tall grass. At first, it just sounded like a squirrel being startled and taking off, but then the sound got louder and more violent. As if it was something deliberately stomping on the ground. The sound then spread 15 feet in each direction and got closer and closer, adrenaline coming, and as I am sitting here thinking that we are about to be mauled by something or taken away by someone, I stepped out from behind the tree and just yelled as loud as I could. It was a deep yell that came from my diaphragm, and the sound stopped. We heard a couple steps jostle around, but no squeals or hoofs galloping, just silence as if whatever was coming towards us took a step back and just watched us. I could feel it. My skin was crawling with the feeling of something's energy being right in front of me, but I could not see within a foot in front of us. I reached over to my wife, grabbed her, and slowly walked away from where we were. The entire way back, I felt as if something was watching us and just staying far enough away to keep my senses on edge. I could feel her presence. As we finally reached the trail entrance, the feeling went away, and whatever was there decided to let up on its applied pressure. I went back and ran the trail many times after this experience, but I still get weird feelings when I approach the exact spot. I still do not know what was in those woods. I hiked 5 miles into the woods in northern Alabama. The campsite was next to a very old cemetery, but that didn't bother me as I work at a funeral home. It was super muggy outside, so after a nice dinner with the sun setting, I decided I would try to sleep. Fast forwarding to approximately 3 a.m., it started to downpour, and I didn't have the rain fly on my tent, so with my little flashlight, I scrambled to get it on to keep water out of the tent, but it was too late. I was already soaked, as were my sleeping bag and pillow. A tree had fallen up on top of the ridge, probably about 200 yards away, and crashed pretty hard. As I lay there listening to the rain, wind, and thunder, something came up right next to my tent and made very loud sniffing sounds. I could hear it walking, as it sounded like it had some weight to it. I believe it was seeking out my dinner leftovers. Bears aren't known in this area, and it could have been a small bobcat, but like I said, this animal sounded like it was bigger. I sat frozen for the 2 minutes it was in my camp, and at daybreak I went to investigate and didn't see a trace. To this day, I have no idea what it could have been. Squatch? Ghost? Biggest bobcat in Alabama? I'll never know. The second story wasn't camping, but something creepy in a lake my friend's dad lived on in rural Missouri. We went fishing for bass, and about 10 feet below the surface, I saw the top of an old house as we got close to it. With the water being extremely clear, I could see down to the porch, and it was stunning. It gives me chills thinking about it. I love caving. Absolutely love it. I even joined a caving club. They send you an information packet once a month about featured cave tours. 1 month they sent out a packet containing a 7 to 8 hour wild man caving tour. I've been on wild man tours before, they're not too difficult. Maybe some rappelling or mild climbing. Nothing over an hour. This one had real danger: climb too much to the right and you get stuck. Slip too far, and you can fall into a hole. Getting rescued in a deep cave is basically impossible. There were 5 of us, 3 tour guides, me, and another person. About halfway through the cave, They let us rest on this shallow ledge thing that was right next to the biggest drop-off of the cave. The guides told us how, with larger groups, they did the typical total darkness, having everyone turn off their headlamps and just look around. When he motioned to us to follow suit, we did. After about 30 seconds, there was this sound. It honestly sounded like footsteps, then falling rocks, and finally a screech. Immediately, the head guide flipped on his headlamp and looked at us with a panicked glint. I think he thought one of us had fallen or jumped off the cliff. He turned to the other two guides and asked if they heard it. They did, but they couldn't explain it. They hadn't moved, and we too were still there. He radioed to the surface and asked if any of the normal tours were missing anyone. This was about 3 hours away from the start of the Wild Man Path, and without our headlamps, it was literally like staring into a wall of black. There was no way an inexperienced or experienced caver would have made it that far. The guides asked us if we wanted to continue with the experience and would understand and refund us if we decided not to. We went along and eventually completed the tour. Everything else was perfectly normal. I have no idea what that could have been. It wasn't animal footsteps, but that screech was blood-chilling. I grew up in a deep holler in West Virginia, dirt roads, wood stoves, etc. When I graduated high school, I went to college in Huntington and was telling a few classmates, friends, about how some places had me electric and such. Well, they decided to come stay with my family and me during a break for like a week. Well, I drove them there, and on a dirt road to where my grandparents live, a bunch of my old friends from high school came flying and swerving around us covered in mud. My newer friends were mortified. Well, I talked to them a bit and told my friends about mudding. We get to my grandparents at sundown and my grandma is making dinner and my grandpa is telling them some folktales he's heard, getting them creeped out. Well, we eat dinner and are all sitting in the living room just talking and we hear this loud ear-splitting scream from outside, maybe 50 yards or so, and it's pitch black out. One of my friends goes white and the other two stand up and go to run out the door cause it sounds like women are just outside screaming. My grandpa puts his arm out and in all seriousness looks at them and says that ain't no woman out there boys, to which my grandma, who looks like a sweet plump little old lady, pipes and he's right, if you go running out there I'm afraid you won't be making it back. That's the Wampus cat trying to get you to come out so she can rip you up. These three decently built men didn't sleep a wink that night, and my grandparents and I still laugh about it to this day. I grew up in upstate South Carolina, which is at the base of Appalachia. My family has many wonderful stories. My family has stories of folks talking the fire out of burns and the blood out of cuts. My family owns a construction company. Once, a young boy fell on one of their jobs. They were worried because the boy's cut wouldn't start bleeding. His mother came out, and she called for another child to call her mother. When the grandmother arrived, she whispered over the cut, and suddenly the bleeding completely stopped, and the cut looked like it was on its way to being healed. The mother explained that her mother could talk the blood out of cuts. According to the lore, if someone tells another person how to do something, they can't do it anymore. So it's only shared through deathbed confessions. My father didn't believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. Also, there's a family story that has been passed down for around 100 years. Once, my great-uncles were out hunting. I literally knew some of them growing up, and they were all honest, lucid individuals. They saw an animal that was a sort of chimera. It looked like a deer but had a tiny human head. It leapt on a fence post and then ran into the woods. Their hunting dogs ran after it, and they were never seen again. So I was through hiking in Vermont, and I wanted to push myself to get to the next shelter. The guide said it was 5 miles away, but in reality it seemed double that. Anyhow, I found myself caught in the dark, trying to follow the white paint marks on the rocks. The wind was howling, and I was starting to get scared. I had missed the shelter since it had been so long. Eventually, I made it to the shelter, only to find it packed along with all the tent sites, so I had to go off the path to find a place to set up. I finally said F and set up my tent in some area that had enough space. I fell asleep absolutely terrified that the wind would knock a tree or large branch over. Here's the actually scary part. I woke up very early to what sounded like 2 people approaching my tent. I was off the path and away from the shelter. No one should have had a reason for being out there. They walked right up to my tent and stopped, not saying a single word. Then they split up, one going to each side. I had a little 3-inch blade, which I pulled out. My food bag was outside, and I knew I couldn't continue without it, and I didn't want to die in my tent from someone I couldn't see, so I figured I'd pop my head out and get this over with. I just unzipped my tent and said, "Good morning." It wasn't people, it was 2 massive moose. Luckily they looked young, and instead of turning me into paste, they both took off in opposite directions. I swear I could hear the ground thud as they ran. I was so terrified they might come back that I packed everything up there and started hiking to the next shelter. When I hunt alone, I often do what is called still hunting, but it's not actually staying still. It's simply stealthing through the forest, frequently stopping and carefully scanning everything around you for any movement, then very quietly and slowly moving another 25 to 30 yards and repeating the silent scan. It's very effective if one knows the terrain fairly well and plays the wind in their favor. Anyway, I'd made my way deep into an old-growth forest area in northern Minnesota, and I was quietly working my way into the wind through a particularly thick, densely forested section of woods. I came to a thick cluster of trees where I could only see 10 to 15 feet in any direction, so I began to move slightly faster as my field of view was too small to effectively stealth into range of any game. When I finally emerged into a small clearing in the center of this tight cluster of trees, I stopped dead in my tracks as I was completely surrounded by bones. Momentarily, I was confused at what I'd stumbled upon, and then it hit me. I was standing in the center of a wolf pack's feeding area. There must have been 8 to 10 different deer and many other smaller critters that had been cleaned to the bone and scattered all around. Needless to say, I didn't stick around to see what was for supper. The timber wolves in northern Minnesota can grow to 150 to 180 pounds. They're huge. I live in the mountains, so I hike a lot. My partner and I normally hike together, but sometimes we split up, where my partner will run up to a predetermined point on the trail while I hike up. I have asthma, so running is not something I can do anymore. My partner normally waits for me at the predetermined spot, and we either hike down together or keep hiking up together. One morning, we went before work and split up. The plan was for my partner to wait for me halfway up the trail. While I was hiking, I felt on edge. This trail runs through the forest for a long time, and normally you hear lots of birds and squirrels, but this time it was silent. I get anxious at times, so I chalked it up to that and kept going. I get to a turn in the trail where I'm hiking past a lot of low brush, and I hear what sounds like a growl. Still thinking I'm just freaking myself out, I clear my throat very loudly in case there is something I can't see and I will startle it out of the brush. Nothing moves, so I keep going. I get maybe 100 feet further, and I run into my partner running down the trail. They look frightened and just say, "There's a cougar." Turns out my partner decided they didn't want to wait for me, so they started hiking back down the trail towards me. They rounded a curve and found a cougar standing in the middle of the trail, sniffing at something. It jumped when it saw my partner and took off down the trail towards where I was hiking. We made it back without incident, and I'll never know for sure, but I think I walked right by a cougar in the brush. We've hiked that trail many times since, and we've even seen cougar prints in the snow a few times. We no longer split up while hiking, and when it feels too quiet, we turn around and hike home. I went on a tubing trip on the Osable River in northern Michigan with family. We went upriver to float down to our property abutting the river. This is in the middle of the Huron National Forest, and it is a gorgeous river for fishing and swimming. My family and I loaded into a pickup truck and headed a few miles upriver to a small trail that leads down to the river. Unfortunately, my uncle nearly missed the turnoff, pulled in a foot off the trail of the drive, and slashed the inside of a tire on a culvert. In total, it was myself, my aunt and uncle in their mid-60s, my cousin, and his 2 daughters. Sadly, no one brought a cell phone, and the spare was rusted to the undercarriage of the truck bed. My aunt, who doesn't like to wait for a solution, decided to hike back to the cabin immediately while we waited. I went with her because my aunt shouldn't be the one to do this in the first place. The walk is along a state road, a 2-lane country highway with either a 55 or 45 miles per hour speed limit depending on how twisted the road is as it winds through the Huron. Both sides of this road are shrouded by tall white and red pines, occasional birches, and the like. Very scenic, very lovely, yet very hot in the early afternoon of early July, when one would rather be tubing down the river. We walked east up the westbound shoulder, and vehicles would pass every few minutes. Typically, you could either hear a distant radio or music playing, followed by the nearing rumble of a car or truck coming. Nothing out of the usual. However, as we walked, we heard what sounded like classic rock music coming from the trees. It was coming closer, and it truly sounded like an oncoming vehicle or someone moving on an ATV or bike, except there was no sound of an engine or rumble of tires. I thought perhaps someone was just out of view in the tree line. There are no houses or cabins on this stretch of road, nor trails or roads. It's pure forest. The sound came closer, and I was trying to identify what song it was, as it sounded somewhat familiar, or so I thought. My aunt, a lovely lady, kept walking and busting asses without so much as a care in the world. I'm rather sure she was cursing my uncle repeatedly. Within the span of 30 seconds, the sound was nearly on top of us, yet we couldn't see any source for the music. As it closed to within 30 feet of us, still off to our left in the forest, it should have been obvious. But it wasn't. And that's when the music became louder, along with a bit of buzzing like static or flies. And then it was there, invisible. It was perhaps 5 feet from us, and it had to be, as I tell myself, a swarm of flies. Buzzing in unison and in differing octaves of the same notes, definitely not classic rock music, but oddly and incredibly musical, and the noise moved at a clip like the passing cars and trucks going 45 to 55 miles per hour. I was expecting to have to swat or run from a swarm, but there was nothing there. No black dots swirled about, nothing landed, stung, or bit us, and as quickly as it came upon us, it kept moving and passed by behind us, heading westward. And as it left our area, the audible buzzing diminished, and its noise warped back into the sounds of classic rock music. Now, I'm aware we used to have a tent bug problem in northern Michigan. This year, Traverse City released scores of black flies to annihilate them, which they have in our neck of the woods. The only thing I can fathom is that it was a swarm of flies buzzing and flying in such a manner as to produce such a noise. However, I've not been able to find any evidence that such a thing can occur. We walked on, and I stated to my aunt that that was the oddest thing, and she shrugged it off, agreeing but not caring. I was hydrated, not drunk, which is blasphemous this time of year in this location, or high, also blasphemy, and dismissed the occurrence as I'll figure it out later.